welcome to What's at Stake, a show about decentralized governance on the Cosmos Hub. My name is Mai Ishikawa Sutton.
And I'm Uday Vira.
And we'll be your hosts for this hour. Since this is our first pilot episode, I'm going to start by taking some time to introduce myself, Haifa Worker Cooperative, and talk a little bit about our goals for this show and why we're hosting these conversations about governance and decentralization. So about who I am. I've been an organizer and writer working at the intersection of technology, digital policy, and the solidarity economy for the last 10 years. I started my career at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And then as I shifted my focus to technology and the digital commons, I worked on various projects, including Shareable, Public Citizen, the Oakland Public Library. I met Haifa through my involvement with a community mesh project in Oakland, California. And since 2019, I've been actually working with the Internet Archive on organizing events and discussions around the decentralized web. And I was one of the stewards of the decentralized web principles. I guess since 2020, we've been working on Compost Magazine and Distributed Press, which is an open source publication tool for the decentralized web. For the past 5 months, I've been working closely with Haifa again to help activate and steward governance discussion on the Cosmos Hub.
And I'm one of the co-founders of Haifa. Haifa is a worker co-op based in Toronto, Ontario. That's in Canada. Haifa has been contributing to the Cosmos Hub since summer of 2021. And the work that we do with the Cosmos Hub is twofold. The first is to lead and manage the testnet program to ensure that all new software upgrades as they become available are tried and tested by the developer and validator community. Mm-hmm. And second is working on governance. So we are trying to activate governance discussions and update documentation so people know how governance how to access governance and participate in it. Haifa, like I said, is a worker co-op that was started in 2019. We came from a community mesh networking project. So a bunch of us started Toronto Mesh, which was a community project here in Toronto. The work that we do is around technical infrastructure for collectives and cooperatives, as well as building organizational and tech capacity for many projects in the decentralized web.
Yeah, so why are we doing this show? Well, it's worth, I think, us being upfront about our viewpoint, which is that we are not technological determinists. We don't approach digital network technology as being revolutionary on its own, but we do think that it's important to sense the potential in new technologies as they emerge. So no matter how interesting or innovative something is in the way that they collect, store, process, and transfer information, it's up to the humans using them that will decide whether something transformative will happen as a result of using those tools. Blockchains do allow networks of computers to verify and coordinate on a course of action. Decisions about those courses of action can be defined by one person, a handful of people, or between tens and thousands of people who don't know or even trust each other. So we think this technology isn't something to snub your nose at, but obviously, because capitalism ruins everything, this tool has mainly been harnessed in ways that have made the powerful more powerful, the rich richer, and many people have gotten caught up in scammy pyramid schemes through hype and a whole lot of hot air.
And yet we're here and you're watching this because there's something truly interesting going on in the space of network technology and governance. And despite so much energy being spent on projects that are fundamentally not about addressing systemic problems, there are certain projects and there are certain blockchain technologies that are opening up people's imagination to new possibilities. And this is the reason why we decided to work on this and why Haifa got involved with the Cosmos, is that we're interested in the potential of this technology as an organizing tool for small and large groups of people to come together and coordinate. Mm-hmm. There's so much thinking and experimentation going on in how to use blockchain to scale systems of coordination and embed trust into these systems of coordination. while also making them resistant to attacks by malicious actors.
Yeah. So what we want to know and why we want you to come on this journey with us is that, what we want to know is what would it look like for people to leverage this power of distributed ledgers, aka blockchains, to better coordinate? What if we examined what was possible with blockchain tech as a means to re-examine how people organize and decide and share things? If blockchain technology has the potential to enable local and community management of resources, as well as mass coordination among millions of strangers, what could that mean for people's ability to organize and solve massive problems? What we want to know is, what can traditional corporations, cooperatives, and communities teach us about governance over our technical infrastructure? And vice versa, will an entire population of crypto natives building their governance muscles lead to more meaningful deliberation in other spaces? That's what we want to explore.
This show is mostly going to be focused on the Cosmos ecosystem, and specifically one blockchain within that ecosystem, which is called the Cosmos Hub. It's a really compelling case study in how thousands of people from around the world are experimenting with governance and building a network of interoperable projects and tools to coordinate resources and own and control digital assets together.
So because the show isn't going to be watched by only people who know what Cosmos is, we want to give a brief Cosmos 101. So Cosmos is a project to create an internet of blockchains. And the overarching goal is to enable anyone with a desire to build a blockchain application to be able to do so as easily as possible, and for that application to be interoperable with all the other blockchain projects across the network. This is enabled through what's called the Cosmos SDK, the software development kit. And that allows people to use a suite of modules to power up their applications without building those components from scratch. And there's also inter-blockchain communication, or IBC, which is the protocol that allows secure messages to be transferred between projects. The Cosmos Hub, whose tokens are Atom, which you might be familiar with, was the first chain to be built using the Cosmos SDK. Atom has been distributed to various teams around the world to build out and sustain all the foundational tooling and protocols and build out Cosmos as an internet of blockchains. So we think that Cosmos and the Cosmos Hub is a really interesting case study for the following reasons. So the first one is that it's a project where a global community of people design and enforce their own rules. Even though much of the governance is enforced and enshrined in code, it's actually the participants who determine how that happens. The Cosmos Hub is also organizationally decentralized, so no one institution is responsible for the long-term success of Cosmos. There are several teams working together on the same open source technology all around the world, as well as 175 validators that operate the software to keep the network running. And we'll talk about with Billy, our guest for today, about the Row upgrade, which is the next software upgrade to the Cosmos Hub, and how a lot of those new upgrade features are about enabling more of this kind of organizational decentralization to happen. And finally, the last reason that we find Cosmos as an interesting case study is that it's fundamentally about interoperability. Instead of locking in its community, Cosmos is about many different projects coexisting and exchanging value with each other through the IBC protocol. And at the same time, it enables communities to govern their projects autonomously. And so the Cosmos Hub is the key project in the Cosmos ecosystem. And its role is to power the rest of the ecosystem and we see it as a source of funding and funding of ecosystem-wide initiatives and nurturing cooperative trade relationships across the Cosmos system. So today we have Billy Rennekamp from Interchain, who is the Cosmos Hub product lead. He's the founder of Clover's Network, a blockchain game that encourages the creation of scarce art. He's also a contributor to Ethereum and Gnosis, and member of Arena, Guild, New Models, and Trust. We're going to spend the rest of the show chatting with Billy about the upcoming Row upgrade, the tooling that will become available for public goods funding on the Cosmos Hub, and his reflections about decentralized governance. Billy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Very much for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So can you start us off by telling us in your own words what you do as product lead of Cosmos Hub?
Sure. So I lead a team here at Interchain, which does a lot of like software integration work and coordination. So there's a single binary, the Gaia D binary. It's a Golang binary that imports the Cosmos SDK and instantiates a blockchain called the Cosmos Hub. But the pieces of that software are developed by a really diverse set of contributors. And they work on it for different reasons or at different purposes or on different parts of it. And it all has to come together at some point to be integrated into a single place. And then that's sort of what needs to be eventually distributed to validators who run the network themselves. And there's a lot of, accountability and checking from the validators because they're the sort of like ultimate operators of this network. And so a lot of them are involved in the actual code itself. But my job is sort of like helping coordinate that the pieces get put together, that the different operators are aware of the work being done, how to use it, when to use it, and helping make sure that their job of actually running the network goes smoothly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess it's that part of Cosmos Hub being such a decentralized organization that makes it work, and that's like what's exciting about it. And so like as Cosmos Hub team lead, you're responsible for that integration coordination. Would you say that this is kind of like, in a sense, a kind of soft governance in managing many of these moving organizations, moving and kind of coordinated organizations?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a recent proposal, and I talked a bit about this, where there's sort of like theoretically, everything that gets put into that binary is at the discretion of the validators and their constituent token holders who delegate their voting rights to, or who can always override and directly participate in the governance of the network. Yeah. And there's this really interesting balance between asking every single question to this group of voters and like them sort of like trusting me or others to sort of like work according to what they expect us to do. One version of this is that like every single PR review, every single like work contract, every single decision inside the entire thing could theoretically go on chain and be like, hey, is this right? Hey, is this what you want? Is this what you want? I have sort of like an optimistic perspective to it, where because I'm sort of all over the place working with so many different people, really keyed into the community sentiment, and also just like the project trajectory and white paper and sort of like purpose of it, that like I try not to overburden the governance system with like every small detail. And if the ultimate decision still takes place when the software is ready and it's included in a governance proposal, like, do you want to run this software? And if I have any sort of doubts about like what's included in that software being contentious, or that like it's not going to be passed, it's like tons of wasted work from all these engineers to actually put that together. Yeah. And so if there's like an important aspect of that decision that feels unclear, then I want to put it on chain. So this recent decision about adding a feature called CosmWasm, which is a virtual machine so that other people can deploy smart contracts directly to the hub, rather than having to integrate it as a native Golang module to the binary. It's like a pretty specific technical detail, but in the past, there's been a lot of debate about whether or not this is a good idea. And so rather than like putting a bunch of time and effort into just doing that work and then be like, here's the work, like, do you guys want it or not? I wanted to make sure that that time wouldn't be wasted in case the network didn't want it. Whereas a lot of other features or other aspects of the work seem like very aligned, or there's very low expectations that there would be controversy around it. And those ones, I don't go to like ask and confirm, is this what you want? I read the room basically. And it has a lot to do with the fact that like there's a balance that validators have requested. Validators are the ones who produce these blocks, the ones who run the software, about like not being overwhelmed with governance, because they run nodes on many different networks and they have to monitor all of them at the same time. And so there's like a signal to noise ratio that you want to try to find the balance between, where you're not like annoying them or getting them mad with every micro decision, but you're also not like surprising them with something that they're like, wait, what the hell is this?
Yeah, yeah. And you also, I mean, you publish a roadmap, right? And so like people can always like look at that roadmap and be like, hey, no, this doesn't really make sense or align with the roadmap, or I want to change the roadmap and like put up a signaling proposal and like get buy-in from the community.
And that informs the roadmap as well. So like last year, there was a proposal to add a feature from a completely external team. They built the feature themselves. They like published the code. They're like, do you guys want this code? They voted yes to include it. And so then like all of a sudden, you know, my job changes a little bit where I'm like, okay, I need to put this code inside of the thing because they've signaled that they want this. I need to make it happen.
Yeah, yeah. How does it feel to be like sort of like your stakeholders are really the community and they can kind of like change direction anytime, right? And so and you know like the community can be fickle, they can change their mind like in the middle, and like you put in a lot of work doing something and then suddenly the world has shifted and you're working on something else. Has that been like a challenge for you, and how do you kind of like cope with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's like a pre-version of that, which takes place just on Twitter. And you could say like the loudest voices are heard first, et cetera.
Yeah.
And it's difficult sometimes to navigate because, you know, you'll get a very small group of people who are very loud and very mad about something very specific. And it's unclear whether or not they actually represent the sort of like real sentiment. I mean, I hate this term, but there's this like silent majority or something. And it's really hard to try to figure out like, is this a real issue? Is this like a small group of people who have an outweighed voice compared to the sort of outcome? And the sort of like final testing measure is of course like the actual on-chain vote that takes place.
Yeah.
And it's not that different, I think, from like a normal sort of corporate structure in which you have shareholders and there's, you know, votes to different capacities, but certainly there's like various degrees of overhead when it comes to coordinating all those voices and making sure that you're getting the right signals.
Yeah.
It can feel terrifying because, yeah, obviously like the internet is not necessarily always the best medium for like coherent or thoughtful discussion.
Yeah.
People try to weaponize systems as soon as possible. We recently had like a vote buying sort of scenario happening, and some people would say it's a feature, not a bug. Definitely like a little bit of the Wild West in terms of like very new tools being used for very real things.
Yeah. Could I ask about that? You mentioned the Cosmosm proposal 69. How would you reflect on how that governance process went and kind of like some of your learnings from that experience?
It's interesting. In some ways, I feel like I was using governance in a really naive way by making the proposal. But it has to do with the fact that we basically have come to like the end of the original white paper and roadmap. You know, we've achieved that sort of like first set of achievements. It doesn't really stop there. And so there's a lot of really exciting directions there, but they're not as, let's say, agreed upon from like a common point of view. And in this sort of like formlessness of like who's calling the shots or something like that, you know, it is really a decentralized network. It can be sort of like terrifying of like, oh, actually you've got like this group over here who are really well informed, but they don't necessarily have the majority share of like making that decision or something like that. And so there's this balance between like keeping your shareholders, you know, informed about the like status, while also like trying to leverage the people who are as close as possible or actually like have real everyday interactions with like the state of things. And I often come back to think about like, there's a lot of interesting hard problems in the blockchain space, but I think actually the hardest one is related to marketing, community, and communication, because there's such a diverse set of participants and the technology is so complicated that it's impossible to like adequately explain or address every issue to every participant, while it's at the same time like a real necessity because these are your actual participants. You know what I mean? Like they are the ones who are going to make the decision at the end. And when things get extremely simplified or polarized, you know, I think we've all seen sort of what can happen with like polarization of, you know, single issue voters or whatever. It can result in really sort of bizarre directions that decisions go in. And Cosmosm one was interesting because, you know, it was like, I think there was a very real, good and interesting technical debate that could occur, But sort of what happened instead is the original founder, who's been, out of touch with the project for years at this point, has like a very strong belief against this feature for like, I think a good reason, like you can point to this sort of like technical debate where it is there, but he's so out of touch with the actual sort of like work that's happening, progress, and like project that he, if he were more involved, I think he would have a different opinion, let's say. But there hasn't been like tons of communication or like a lot of transparency about like what happened, why did he leave, why is he not involved in it now? And so if you just sort of approach the project naively, you're like, oh yeah, here's the founder, this is what he said he wants to do, like easy. On top of that, he's like launching his own blockchain and said, anybody who votes against me won't receive tokens on this new blockchain. So it's like a pretty simplistic decision tree. I mean, you're like, oh, cool, founder said that and I get paid if I don't do it. Like, I'll just do that. Whereas I think if you were like a lot closer to the actual development of the project or more involved, you would have a much more sort of like attuned idea of like the actual risks and balances. But he really sort of took the extremist sort of fear mongering, in my mind, sort of way, which I think is unfortunate. Luckily, the decision, I don't think, was critical, let's say, to the success of the project. And making a proposal to sort of say, hey, I know that there's going to be a debate about this. I need like clarity from some source of authority, and the ultimate authority is the chain. It spurred a lot of really productive conversation. However, just because of the way like very simplistic governance systems work in the scenario, I think we witnessed sort of like very quickly polarization of a topic, let's say. And I would love to see a lot more analysis of like Twitter sentiment, voting records, analysis of the votes, because I feel like there's a lot of really interesting statistical insights that might be like, oh, how do people vote? Do they go to the proposal and they see, okay, it's 60% yes, even though only like 10% of the network have voted, does that impact the fact like, oh, I just want to vote with what everybody else is doing, or it seems like, or am I waiting actually for like, basically representatives or people who I sort of like trust as their sort of opinions. Like, I think that a lot of the most informed people came to really productive conversations out of this. And at the end, we're all sort of like on board with this proposal. But at that point, it was kind of too late. The like popular narrative had escaped. You had a lot of a high quantity of votes that all had very, very small shares, who maybe, don't invest a lot of time or interest in the sort of like underlying aspects of the thing. But, for better or worse, it went in this other direction.
One of the things that Maya and I were actually talking about when this was all going on was that actually it feels like there's a lot of incentive for positive reinforcement of a proposal, like deliberation wise, before it goes on chain. But there's no like incentive for negative, like constructive, like feedback, basically.
If you're against it.
If you're against it, it's actually like better for you to like wait for it to go on chain and then pull out your negative, like, like your negative points, because then that can just like shoot down a proposal.
And also use like all the mechanisms of like soft governance, like Twitter and the power of Twitter and like marketing around that, right? Like,
so it's like, it's kind of in your best interest to not give constructive, like negative feedback, right, on the forum, because you can just torpedo the whole initiative, and that's partially because like the chain is immutable, right? We don't have a mechanism to like update the proposal on chain. Like it's one and done, and then once it's torpedoed, it's done.
Somebody gave me advice afterwards. They were like, you never put a proposal on the chain until you've talked to like all of the validators and been like, can I count on your vote? Really like a floor whip inside of the Congress or House of Representatives, whatever it is. And like, I mean, I didn't want to do that because I didn't feel like I had a strong opinion that this should happen. I mean, I personally had an opinion that it should happen, but more as like a individual atom holder and a user. And that's sort of a conflict of interest, I'd say, like,
right.
It's not my decision, it really is the larger decision. So I was like, I want, I want to be unbiased in putting this up. Like, certainly I can say, I'm wearing my personal Atom holder hat and say, I think it's a good idea. But like, as the person who's supposed to coordinate this upgrade, like, I need your input.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm sort of like, damn, is it really not possible to make like an honest, good-willed question? Like, do I have to be really specific and like try to like pick out the votes beforehand and not do anything until otherwise? But I mean, it's interesting because it sort of like separates votes into two categories. It's like ones in which the proposal like absolutely wants it and is going to go to war to make it happen. And the other, which is just like, hey, like, it's almost like a survey, you know. And when I think
Temperature
about
check.
proposal, yeah, a temperature check. And
Yeah.
I feel like I was approaching with a temperature check, and it made me feel like, oh man, this is not the most sophisticated mechanism for a temperature check.
Right. Maybe there should be like ways to like label what type of proposal it is. Hey, this is like, we don't need to go to war about this. This is just like, we're just trying to get it. We're just trying to do a survey here.
Right. I mean, the other problem is that people don't really engage in the discussion until it's like
High
about
priority.
to go on chain or it's already on chain, right? So there has to be kind of like this like pressure for people to feel like it's worth their time to then start engaging with it. And
Yeah. I wonder if like there's like, this is not a pre-proposal, but this is proposal number 1, and this is the first time we ask. We're going to ask again in 3 weeks, like whether or not this passes or fails, we're going to ask again. And like, you know, it's only going to be the 3rd time that we ask that we actually use the results or something like that. Or I don't know, 2 out of 3. It just gets tough.
right.
Like
Like lower the stakes somehow for the proposer.
Yeah. I know there's a couple of people who are working on like sort of sequenced proposals where they have like one signaling proposal and then a follow-up proposal and things like that.
Actually, yeah. So there was a conversation this week about, so there's a hackathon in Korea.
That's what I was talking about. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting.
Can you talk about it? Because
there's a hackathon that's they're folks who trying to seek funding for a hackathon in, I think also in Korea. We were talking about Korea before the show started. And they're going to use a signaling proposal to gauge whether the community wants to spend money on this thing, but they don't want to get the money right up front because of volatility in the market. So they're going to just do a check-in first, and then after the event is done, that's when they'll actually do the community spend proposal.
So they're basically relying on the fact that there would be, if it passes as a signaling proposal, they're relying on the idea that when they make it as an actual spin proposal, they can count on those votes to vote the same way they did the first time. Although there's nothing that enforces that connection. So since it could change, market could change, and all of a sudden, you know, you're relying on this thing, but there's nothing that enforces it during the second vote.
Trust
Trust
in the community.
Right.
Trust in the trustless system.
Maybe we should shift the conversation a little bit. Yeah, we really wanted to talk about the row upgrade. So you previously described it as the public goods upgrade. We want to hear what that unlocks for decentralized governance and some of the things you've been talking about. But before that, could you describe what public goods means in this context?
Sure. So people sometimes ask, like, what is the purpose of the Cosmos Hub? You know, right now, it's basically a chain that keeps track of Atom. And you need Atom to keep track of the Atom, but to have the Atom, you need, it's just sort of this like, wait, is this just a token for the sake of a token or something? I think that there's a lot more nuance in that. I mean, the sort of most obvious one is that Atom is, you know, the most listed on centralized exchanges. So it's the most convenient on-ramp and off-ramp to the class of assets and network of tokens that we connect to, whereas a lot of those tokens have trouble getting listed on centralized exchanges. So it's sort of like a gateway drug, you could say, to like assets.
To be Cosmos pilled.
Yeah, exactly. The sort of like long-term purpose of the hub has always been described as a infrastructure level for routing packets on this internet of blockchains. But in early days, it's still easier to just have every single network connect directly to every single network. In the early days of the internet, it was easy to have every computer connect to every single computer that was part of like the intranet or whatever sort of precursor was. But at a certain point, that stops making sense, and you start needing like topographic sophistication for network routing, and you'd use a hub and spoke model. So the hub is meant to serve that sort of purpose. In the interim, there's sort of this question of like, okay, well then what is the hub? And if you zoom out a little bit, you can see that all of this technology that's been built was funded by the fundraiser that was for the Atom token that went to building not just the Cosmos Hub as a blockchain. In fact, it took way longer because we decided not just to launch a blockchain, we decided to build a software development kit for other people to launch their own blockchains. Because the real sort of value of this whole thesis is that application-specific blockchains are how you unlock mass adoption and scalability and the aspects of sovereignty that are necessary to sort of run networks sophisticatedly for mass adoption. And so the Atom has been this public goods funding infrastructure since day one. It's building these open source tools that others can use for free to launch their own networks, their own products, their own systems that don't require anything to sort of run. Not only the Cosmos SDK, but Tendermint, the consensus engine, as well as IBC, which is the protocol that connects everything together. And so you could also justify the existence of Atom and the Cosmos blockchain as a public goods blockchain. It's meant to provide the tools and the necessary means to create these application-specific blockchains, which participate in this internet of blockchains. That's happened in a few different ways. You know, the most obvious and direct is through the Interchain Foundation, who received an allocation of these tokens, and it's used that treasury to pay the different engineering teams to build public goods source software. It's all Apache 2 licensed. But there's a lot of other sort of like public goods which become more important as the story evolves. Things like the network routing itself, which is performed by relayers, and sort of further distribution of funds as more engineering takes place that isn't best served by a single Swiss entity necessarily. And so the row upgrade has a lot of features that will make the Cosmos Hub able to better perform that sort of duty of distributing funding and support for public goods development. And one sort of goal in that direction is that it would be utilized not only for the funding of these pieces of public goods technology that we've already talked about, but public goods for other networks as well. It has this position as, you know, the initial chain, the project which started all of it, the core contributors are the ones who produce the technology itself, and whose, you know, purpose is the success of all, compared to like a new chain which just launched and has a very specific purpose for its application and its very specific user group. You know, that's great for them to develop technology exactly for that purpose, but it's also great to have an entity whose vision is, you know, much broader for all of them. And so some of the features and the row upgrade make it possible not only to continue the sort of distribution of support and funding for our public goods, but for those other teams to do it in a sort of like neutral zone, systems which have been sort of tested in a longer capacity for, you know, the original public goods that we all were worried about compared to these new and emerging public goods. And again, to answer, I guess, the question about what I consider public goods, I mean, besides the sort of like textbook definition in our area, it's routing, it's funding, it's capacity, it's attention, and it's a user base, I'd say. And no, I don't think I should put security under public goods because that's something you have to pay for.
Like Interchain security could be a public good.
Well, yeah, I would say that's Interchain service more than public good.
Or like a paid thing as opposed to you just got this for free.
Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. I love the idea of like the Cosmos Hub being the sort of space for the neutral space for Interchain governance. I wonder if you can, one of the things that Maya and I were talking about last night actually was like, speculating about like, what would it look like to build a sort of like security council, like a UN security council equivalent on like the Cosmos Hub, where you have like representations from like all the different chains, and you could use something like the groups module, right? And like have like an account from each one of the chains together, and you can make like ecosystem wide governance decisions together. But I'm curious to hear from you if you like have like some speculations about what this sort of like interchain governance format might look like on the hub
with these new upgrades.
Yeah, with these new upgrades coming up.
Yeah, funny, somebody was asking me about the kind of like UN Security Council. I was jokingly calling it like Interchain Interpol. where it became really present with the collapse of Terra recently, where it wasn't only the sort of like economic fallout, which is, I think, very specific to that application. You know, I don't think that that application needed to should have other people who are like policing the details of their application. But when it impacts the other networks that they're connected to through their IBC connections, there is like a potential fallout that hits other people. And so like there was emergency upgrades that basically prevented that chain from being taken over because the token became so cheap that it would cost like $4-5 million to buy enough of the tokens to steal the like $400 million, which are still sort of connected to that chain.
Yeah.
And that the Cosmos Hub could serve as sort of this like neutral authority to some capacity, or some group of people could be that are able to make the decisions on behalf of those kinds of networks and those kinds of scenarios. The feature of that that's kind of similar is the idea that right now there's basically pairwise relationships between each network or their foundation and service providers like relayers who make sure that their network has connectivity to the other networks. And those are, you know, relatively complicated agreements, and each of them have to have their own agreements with each of the relayers. Whereas if they were all able to just have a single agreement with the Cosmos Hub on behalf of those different networks, you know, there'd be a lot less overhead. In parallel, it would simplify the topography of how things would necessarily connect. And so that's one of the real sort of like goals of this upgrade and these features, is that if we figure it out for ourselves and we do it in a way that it can be leveraged for other people, that we can, you know, become a nexus of coordination and support as a sort of like neutral party in the middle, allowing these relationships to exist. And the actual features that begin to make this possible are improvements to the Gov module, the addition of a groups module, and there's a stretch goal related to something called a budget module that might not be done for the row upgrade, but it's definitely in this sort of category of features. I'm not sure how in depth on each of those I should sort of get into though. What would you prefer?
I would be curious on like the applications of each actually, like what does it unlock for governance specifically? So groups would allow like, you know, multiple people to come together and make decisions. It's kind of like a souped up multi-sig, right? That's the way I understand it.
Yeah. It's a souped up multi-sig, and if you have the perspective that a DAO is just a souped up multi-sig, then you can also say that it's a DAO framework.
Yeah.
So the groups module is, if you have the starting point of the multi-sig, a multi-sig is a account. It's a private key account that that key is broken into basically multiple keys, or the idea of a transaction being signed has to take place from multiple keys that get combined into a single signature. And that's great, and it does the job on a lot of networks, except for one problem is that you can't, for instance, change the membership, and you also can't change the voting weights. So each single key has, you know, one voting power, and you can decide how many N of M are necessary before it gets done, but you can't say like this person should have twice as much voting as that person, for instance. And so the groups module is the mechanism of a multi-sig written at the application layer so that you can do things like swap out who's inside of it and what is the voting policy, meaning like how much of voting power does each key have and why. And those can also be adjusted. So it's a lot more flexible and accommodating to sort of evolving needs for collectively managed account.
Yeah. For us, like as Haifa, we're a cooperative. So, you know, one member gets one vote. And that's like a really like good use case for a cooperative to have on-chain representation, because, you know, we could use the same sort of voting policies that we have internally as an organization on-chain. That's like the immediate use case that I think of when I think about the groups module.
And I mean, I guess what I wanted to ask you too is about how the groups module could be used to then decide how to fund different public goods on the Cosmos Hub itself. I think I heard you talk about that somewhere else.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier there's this tension between it's up to the chain to decide, but we also don't want to overload the chain with every decision.
Right.
And one of the sort of configurations that we found effective there is basically working groups. And so a working group is, a designated group of experts or people who are really sort of like involved or hold a concern for that specific campaign or endeavor. Often it's an engineering effort or something like that. And if you want the hub to sort of fund that, it makes a lot of sense to take like a lump sum and put it into a group who's able to make micro decisions on behalf of that. Send very small payments to different people over time for different reasons, make decisions that, they've basically been trusted to carry out an otherwise overall decision. We want to do this thing. We trust this group of people to do it. Here's the money to do it. Good luck. And if that were to happen with a multi-sig, which it typically does currently, there's obviously the limitations that I mentioned earlier of a multi-sig, changing membership, et cetera. And so groups modules make the sort of working group configuration for endeavors that are funded in lump sums from the hub a lot easier to carry out.
Would you say like long term, just speculating out, would you imagine like even say the hub team, like the team that's developing and integrating all this code, the team that you're part of would also be like represented as a working group on chain, or like who are the customers of this new feature long term?
It's definitely a topic that's come up a lot more and more lately, sort of decentralizing the support mechanisms for the hub for the actual decentralization of the project, and also to remove a single sort of point of failure from funding from the Interchain Foundation. I imagine one of the first sort of like high profile users or user stories is a group called the Builders DAO or Builders Foundation, previously called the IBC DAO. And so we've got the Interchain Foundation, and like I said, it was part of the fundraising event for the Cosmos Hub, which means that it received 10% of the atoms, as well as the Ether and the Bitcoin, which went into the original fundraising organization. IBC, of course, is a technology. This is the network, sort of the interoperability protocol that is serving way more than just the concerns of the Cosmos Hub. And so there's all these other networks who are invested in this technology, want to see it succeed, and also have very specific needs that are maybe outside of the direct application of the Cosmos Hub. Now, I also mentioned the Cosmos Hub's concern is this entire internet of blockchains, but it's also difficult, I think, to hold, the whole world in your hands. And there's certainly room for sort of more specific and direct access to funding and development that impacts your product. So while it's all good that the Atom is concerned with the success of IBC for all, there's also a lot of room for projects who are willing to allocate large amounts of money to making sure that this technology continues to meet their exact needs and prioritize those needs above others. And so the IBC DAO was sort of formed out of a desire to make sure that funding which these other projects wanted to make available was managed by a group that wasn't strictly in the service of the Cosmos Hub. You know what I mean? It's funny because we're kind of talking about the Cosmos Hub as being this neutral ground, while at the same time the need for this IBC points to the limitations of that at the same time.
Well, I mean, it's a neutral ground for people to create these new systems on top of, right? Like the fact that the IBC DAO is forming on the Cosmos Hub means something about the Cosmos Hub is neutral.
It's true. And I think it points more to the idea of like attention and capacity more than like conflict of interest. Just like these people are only thinking about this thing versus these people think about this thing and this other thing. It's just one more thing to think about. It's and what's interesting about, I was going to talk about Interchain accounts actually. It's sort of like another feature coming this upgrade and points to a solution that has erupted as a problem related to the Builders Foundation. So because there's all these other networks who are willing to put money towards this group, they would do their own funding proposals on their own networks. And at the end of that funding proposal, it usually, like I said, today goes to a multi-sig holder. And that means that this entity has to have multi-sigs on all of these different networks in order to manage those funds. And so that problem of like membership management, or if somebody joins or leaves, is exacerbated, I can never pronounce that word, across these networks.
Yeah, across all.
Multiplied, thank you. So it's not only that the membership group on the Cosmos Hub managing atoms, maybe needs to evolve over time, but they also like have that same group of people who are replicated on each network. And groups module is great because now you can change that membership criteria, but you still need to change that membership criteria on each one of those networks. And a lot of those networks aren't going to upgrade with the groups module for a while longer. So the reality is that we have these multi-sigs right now. With Interchain accounts, you're able to have a groups module on the Cosmos Hub, and it is able to create and manage accounts by proxy on all of these other networks. And so it's not that the account on that other network is controlled by a private key, multi-sig, or a native groups module there, which keeps track of membership locally. It's managed by a remote groups module that's on the Cosmos Hub. So if the membership changes here, by default, it changes everywhere that groups module account is controlling those remote Interchain accounts.
That's pretty cool. So it's just a normal account, but the key is actually this sort of shared key, and that's managed by the group.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I think when I was originally thinking about the sort of like UN Security Council model, I was kind of thinking of Interchain accounts allowing the sort of other chain to have representation on a group on Cosmos Hub.
Oh wow, yeah. Actually, that's I didn't think about that, but that's wild.
yeah. So you can have like you can have like a group of like all of these chains, and like for like a decision to be made on this group, you'd have to like be voting. You'd have to essentially have like a governance proposal on each one of the individual chains.
Which brings up the next feature. Actually, it's a great segue to the row upgrade. So there's an update to the governance module itself. Previously, the governance module had very specific proposals, which it was able to execute. There's like a spend proposal, there's an upgrade proposal, there's the signaling proposal like we talked about, and then there's parameter change proposals, which have to do with each module's application parameters. But with the new change, the governance module becomes a lot more like an account itself. So, I mentioned already, but there's, a single key account, which most people would interact with on their day-to-day sort of interactions. There's a multi-sig account, like we talked about, that has its limitations and its benefits. And then there's like a module account. So in like Ethereum world, you can think of a smart contract as being able to like hold money or do things. The Gnosis safe is a great example of a smart contract wallet. It's what we would call a module account. So it's code that holds the money, but it does things, it only does what it's allowed to do according to the rules inside of it. And there's a bunch of different module accounts that exist inside the Cosmos SDK that hold money and do very specific things. So like the community pool itself is a module account. It holds money on behalf of the whole chain, but it can't do anything except for exactly what it's allowed to do in there. Yet it's still looked at or seen as an account from the software level. And so the governance module is becoming a module account, and it's becoming a really special version of a module account because not only can it, hold money the same way it does already with the community pool, but it can now execute messages as if it were like a private key controlled account.
Yeah.
So as a private key controller account, I can execute a message send, which is, transferring money. I can execute a vote. And now the governance module itself can execute any of those messages, but of course it has to be voted on before it can execute those messages. And so the combination, it basically is a groups module, except for the membership criteria is token holders. And, that's their constituent voting power is how much token they have. And when combined with Interchain accounts, it means that groups module, which can now execute any message type, can also execute these Interchain account messages, which means that the governance module of a blockchain can own and control an account on another blockchain. The only things that account can do are whatever was voted on by that origin blockchain, but it would make it possible to have this UN configuration where you've got these remote blockchains They each have their governance modules. Those governance modules are able to vote to say, let's create an account on the Cosmos Hub. If that vote passes, the outgoing IBC packet will instantiate an account on the Cosmos Hub. And now that blockchain can control that account through its governance mechanism. So that account could be added to a groups module, and that groups module could have some UN security vote going up, and each member has one vote. So now they get to decide, we're going to vote on our vote. And then that vote gets voted on.
Yeah, and that's how you build new Interchain standards on the Security Council and the Cosmos Hub. And the last feature you talked about was the budget, but the budget feature, which is pretty cool, right? It allows people to like come together and budget, make budgets together.
Yeah, so the budget module actually came from previous development work on a DEX from a team called bharvest. And inside of DeFi, there's this really common configuration of encouraging people to do certain things by paying them. The thing they mostly want to do is they want to encourage you to add liquidity to marketplaces. And so if you do that and you sort of prove that you have liquidity in that market through a token, you receive other payment tokens. But that same mechanism could be leveraged for any sort of a continuous payment stream. And so it was designed to be tightly integrated to the inflation rewards that take place on Cosmos SDK blockchains. There's a parameter that every time a block is produced, new tokens are created, and they're rewarded to the block producer and the delegators who are making that block producer eligible for producing blocks. However, 2% of those, at least in the Cosmos Hub, this is a parameter, are siphoned off before they go, and they're put into that community pool. So that's where the funding source comes from for this community pool that I mentioned earlier. And the budget module sits right between those two actions. So that 2% is taken from the block reward, and before it goes to the community pool, the budget module says, hey, do you want to take some percentage of that and send it to some other account every single time it's produced, so that you're able to have, you know, a piece of the continuous inflation rewards, not just go to the community pool, but say to the engineering team who's like working on the software itself, so that they don't need to make a proposal to the community pool every 6 months or whatever. It's able to be a continuously streaming funding source.
Oh, interesting. Oh, this is the first time I really understood what the budget module was. I didn't realize the money, the source of funding was inflation. I thought it could be attached to any account that would be able to like stream out money from that account or atoms from that account.
Yeah, and it's why I still label it as a stretch goal, because it doesn't feel super clear to me whether or not that singular use of it is what we should be pushing for right away. Because like I said, I would really love to see the Cosmos Hub become reproducible for other projects. And if that were the case, the budget module should be modified. So it's not just the inflation rewards as the source, but it should be any arbitrary source.
Yeah.
And in that way, you know, I'm Osmosis Chain or whatever, I can come over and say, hey, I'm going to put in $1 million for the year of 2022, and I want this to go to paying relayers to make sure all of my packets are streamed. And then the same sort of list of recipients who are already pre-vetted by the Cosmos Hub for receiving that funding, otherwise from the budget module, would just be able to be like reused. And they're basically trusting Cosmos Hub to do the evaluation process of like, who's getting funded, why, you know, I'm going to add my concern, I'm going to add my funding. And because it's the same concern as yours, which is keep the packets rolling, you know, I can trust that this list is not going to be filled with scammers or people who aren't doing a good job.
Yeah.
And by Cosmos Hub proving that, you mean through the governance process?
Yeah.
Right.
Cool. Anything else?
Yeah, no, I think it's just really, I feel like it creates a lot of new, I guess, like, I don't even know if it's right to call it like a topology of like decision making, but like just so many kind of ways of decentering and kind of like
it's a lot of knobs.
Yeah, and like kind of making like new feedback loops for, and also just like adjustments for the feedback loops, and figuring out, you know, how are all of these tooling capabilities like allowing people to kind of like input what is needed as a public good to kind of like raise the tide for everybody, right? You know, I guess like what is like what's a danger here? Like, do you think like, even though it's all designed to kind of like decenter power, in what ways do you think this could be kind of like captured in some way, or, you know, become problematic, if like, yeah, I don't know. I just want to hear your thoughts about that.
I was on a really fun panel with Kia Kreutler a couple weeks ago, which was related to this topic, and you know, the person was asking sort of about the promise of decentralized autonomous organizations, and the idea that, you know, these systems are built to self-actualize and self-regulate and all these sorts of things, and that the sort of like the joke there is that like under the hood, you know, it's not software with like the perfect parameters or protocol executing these things. It's a bunch of people who are supposed to be like actually running these things. You know, it's just, it's almost like hilarious that you call it autonomous, because it's, you know, people who have to be involved in all these decisions sort of constantly. But I think that the idea there points to the idea that you need to find out what can be automated, and what can't be automated, you need to be putting up to vote to the right decision makers. And that question of like the right decision makers is a really hard one, and one that needs to sort of like constantly be visited and adjusted. And that's the sort of like aspect of living governance, you know. It's one thing to be able to have an impact on this, but it's another thing to care. It's another thing to be properly incentivized to care. It's another thing to like have the attention span to care. And that's where that sort of topic came up earlier about validators who, yes, they care, but like they're dealing with a ton of proposals all the time from different directions, you know, like, please don't ask me everything, just ask me the things that are necessary so that I'm able to give it the attention that I need. And it's funny because this talk was organized by another co-op, and I was sort of like came to the realization that it's like, if you have a co-op, you've probably got like the mechanism and the decision power to sort of like carry out your purpose. You know, you probably don't need a blockchain for what you're doing. You're likely living in the meat space, and you know these people you're working with, and you trust them, and that's like so much more efficient and more powerful than like trying to leverage a decentralized technology. There are certain scenarios where that is not the case, and that makes a lot of sense to use these systems, like the operation of a decentralized network for sure. But it was like, it's actually not so much what can blockchains do for co-ops, but there is this really interesting question of what can co-ops do for blockchains, because blockchains really need people who are familiar and experienced with participating in governance. You know what I mean? They need people who know how to like discuss something, what protocols should be taken before it goes on chain. How do you make sure that the discussion's healthy and that the outcome, you know, reflects the needs of the question in the first place? Like these are, you know, questions that have been important to human civilizations for thousands of years. And there's like a huge demand for like people, real people, smart people, people who care, and people who want to do this work, because there's just more and more of these networks who have more and more of these decisions and more of these processes that need like human beings to be keyed in, to be informed, and to care. Like you'll often see people evaluating blockchain projects by their community. And I think that, you know, it's such an important aspect of it. Technology is one thing, but it's never going to be enough. You need actual people who care about keeping the system running, because it's always going to be an imperfect solution at the technological level, but it doesn't matter as long as you have people who care, who are willing to improve it. And like, that's why it's one of my favorite aspects of being in this industry, is because it's like, there's just huge need for people who are interested in care. And like, there's like, it's great to be needed, I guess.
Yeah, how do you get people to care is like the question that we always come back to when we're talking about governance. And I feel like in a lot of like blockchain conversations, the answer to how do you get people to care is by throwing more money at it, which I don't think is like the right answer. Not the only, I mean, it is an important answer also. Like you need to pay for labor, and care is labor, but it's not the only answer. I mean, I think one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot is like, how do you make the space like inviting and warm and like safe for a lot of people? Because I think in many in many of the conversations, I feel like a lot of the conversations get really like quite heated and quite intense. And I think a lot of the people who could care or want to care feel like, these conversations are not the right spaces for them because they feel like inaccessible technically, but also like, like sometimes like demoralizing because that sort of care labor isn't as valued.
Right. And it's also the problem. I mean, at the same time, the fact that people are so passionate is also like really what's interesting and great, and why so many experiments are able to kind of like happen,
Yeah.
I think. And so it's kind of this balance between like, how do you make sure that people are able to have like heated conversations and like debates about the future of the shared system, and how do you kind of like allow new people to come in to kind of share their input and also like solve problems for them too, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, that's a difficult problem, and it's a problem that's become more and more important as more and more communication, especially, takes place in asynchronous formats. It's like it's not a solved problem, and I don't have really, great proposal for you either. But I think we're all aware of that problem, and what the dangers of the sort of lack of solutions there are. The loudest voice being the sort of one that takes the lead, even though it has maybe the least at stake or the least informed sort of aspects of it. The terrible behavior that people on the internet perform when they think that they don't have their real identities attached to it, etc. Even just sort of like the most benign ways where you like have Discord channels that have like a slow roll, whatever it's called, where like you can't make more than one post within 1 minute. It's like we're still really exploring how do you effectively communicate in digital platforms, and it's an extremely integral part of online governance systems because it's humans can be hijacked really easily through
Totally. So we have some kind of like looking ahead questions. What are some DAOs that you're really excited to see in the future? I guess like enabled by all this tooling.
I've wanted to see since like before the network even launched, basically like consumer ranking type entities for evaluating validators. So I think it's a really dangerous and unhealthy configuration that people join a network, they have some tokens, they want to participate in securing the network, so they have to pick a validator who to delegate to. And the obvious way to do it is to see who's going to pay me the most. And that has to do with like how low of a commission that validator is willing to take. But often, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and there's real risk to the people who are willing to take very low commission rates often because they don't have another way to compete. The alternative is basically brand recognition. So you might join and be like, oh, Coinbase, I've heard of them. That's like a real company. I should delegate to them because they'll probably do a good job, but like they have totally adverse incentives for many aspects of the network. They have a very specific target user group, and they're serving those purposes, but not the other network participants. And so it's really difficult to sort of decide who should I delegate to. And like I've like kind of come up with like a rule of thumb where it's like, oh yeah, you shouldn't delegate to anybody in like the top 20 because then they have too much control of the network, and that's unhealthy. You don't want to delegate to anybody in the bottom 20 because they might just disappear because they don't have that much at stake. Within that like middle range, you want to find somebody who like does have a good commission rate, because I mean, of course incentives is part of this, but you also don't want to have anybody who's too low because there's something fishy about that, and they might be trying to accumulate power so that they can change their price all of a sudden. And so you have to like watch it all the time to see if they're changing it all the time. And then there's the totally unseen parts, which are like, oh, that validator produces a block explorer, which everybody uses and it's really valuable. Or like, oh, that validator does this other thing, which is really great for the network's health or for the participation, but it might not be easy to connect. And a lot of validators actually do those things because they hope that they get connected. Oh, I did use that service once, and that's the same name. Or like wallets, there's a lot of wallets who also have validators because they're in your face all the time. You recognize that brand, and at the same time, wallets are hard to monetize. So they are sort of like public goods themselves, and we all benefit from their use, but we don't have to pay for them. So why don't we accommodate those wallet producers by delegating to their validators and make sure that they're able to sort of earn an income from that? But somebody whose job it is, or in a not compromised state, because as soon as you like get into this game, you might also want to be a validator and give yourself a high rating. But like, yeah, Consumer Protection Bureau, who's like saying, this is, you know, our top 10 validators on these criteria. We think this is the right combination of like health for the network, economic upside, stability, and integrity. And also there should never just be one of those, you know, consumer rating things. There should be multiple ones who, you know, competing against each other, et cetera. And to have that information more present when you're like picking a validator, I think can do a lot for sort of the decentralized nature of the block production, health of the network, public goods, et cetera. So it's not just a kind of race to the bottom for validators or get rich as fast as possible for the delegators.
In the same vein as like ranking and rating, what about something like an auditing DAO for like code? Also, like one of the problems that validators I've spoken to have is that, you know, the top few validators have governance teams who can like go and like actually like investigate the code, because the software upgrade proposals that go through governance, you know, require validators to go in and look at the code and vote on the code. But not all validators have the sort of like manpower to go and actually like look at the code, right? It's also a different skill set. They're like node operators, they're not, you know, developers necessarily. But what if, you know, you could fund that through like a public goods in the same way that you're funding like a rating system for validators? You could fund sort of like oversight or rating system for like code.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a network called Certic, who's a Cosmos SDK chain, basically started as an auditing company, and that's really similar to sort of like what their network is targeted at sort of performing. It also reminds me, just in the vein of like the entity which gives validators ratings, like being able to technically evaluate the proficiency of those validators. You know, like, are they all using Amazon Web Services? So if Amazon Web Services goes down, the entire network goes down. Do they have redundant network nodes? How are their keys stored? Is it in a physical rack? Do they have access to it? You know, like all of these things should play into sort of like, what grade did this validator get on the sort of how good of a job are they doing? Because you don't really find out until it's too late, you know, when there's an outage or all of a sudden half the nodes are down because they're all using the same infrastructure, the same operator. You know, there's also this idea of white labeling where you pay somebody to run your validator. If you pay the same person to run all the validators, you know, that's a super precarious configuration where if they go down, too much goes down with them.
Yeah. Michelin stars for validators. Someone should shut the company.
Exactly.
Well, yeah.
And it has to be Michelin because, you know, the rubber industry is never going to be compromised inside the food industry.
Right.
Really far away.
Yeah.
Well, we're at the hour. I wanted to ask you if you had any kind of like last thoughts or plugs you wanted to make.
Gosh, I don't know. Say hi on my Twitter Spaces every Wednesday if you're interested in getting more involved. I do it every week. It's exhausting, but it's rewarding, and it's for you.
Those are great. I've been listening to so many of them, and I've learned so much. That's a real public service.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. It was great to have you, Billy, on our inaugural episode for this show.
Yeah, I'm so glad you guys are doing this. This is really fun.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Cool. Thank you.